We now have the pleasure of hearing from Heidi Adams. Very few people exemplify the notion of taking action when one's own situation calls for it. Heidi is a survivor of Ewing sarcoma, which she was treated for in her 20s. And since that time, she has been involved in supporting the AYA cause in many different ways, initially in forming Planet Cancer, which was one of the first advocacy and support organizations to use electronic media and social media so effectively. This eventually became part of the Livestrong Alliance, and recently has formed now Critical Mass, which is a newly formed group that is also going to look at developing many ways to support the AYA cause, and is just beginning the mission and has chosen Heidi as their CEO. So in that capacity, she's going to talk to us about her journey and where the field is moving from the advocacy standpoint. Thank you so much for joining us today, Heidi.
Sorry. I'm going to work off my iPad today. I decided to spare you some slides. There have been a lot of slides today. Slides are good. But I think I'm here in a couple of different capacities, and it's in some ways it's really easy for me to cross over the patient perspective and the advocate perspective and my professional life and my personal life, and in some ways it's harder. But it's always an honor to stand in front of a group like this and to represent patients. It's not the first time today that you will hear the perspective. I think Brad's slides gave a lot of insight and evidence-based sort of look at the patient perspective. And then the data on college students and the military show a lot of the different challenges that face young adults, and challenges that are only exacerbated by a cancer diagnosis and the Strouds. I don't think you could get a more powerful testimonial or insight into what it's like to be a young person with cancer. So thank you for that. So a lot of what we've heard today is about the field and the population or the age group. And believe me when I say I'm excited about that, because to be recognized as a field is something that a lot of us have worked a long time for and have worked really hard for, and it's something to celebrate. It's validation of what a lot of us have been doing for a long time. And there's some of us who've been working in the field for 15, 20 years. I mean, Archie pretty much invented the field. And some of us who were young adults when this whole thing started now have young adulthood kind of far in the rear view mirror. And by some of us, I mean Brad, Brandon, of course. But the field is kind of impersonal. And I want to close out the day by sort of grounding the conversations in some key personal experiences. Some are mine and some are others. So I'm going to just touch on a couple of the themes we've heard throughout the day. I'm going to pick a couple of issues, not comprehensive, but put a face on them for you and hopefully relate it back to the field in a different way. And I think it's important, because as Dan said earlier today, beyond all the data in clinical trials is a patient with dreams and with aspirations, and we can't forget that. So while I've been in and have even led a lot of meetings about the field, what always, always, always keeps me grounded is that memory of being 26 years old and standing in front of a screen at my orthopedic surgeon's office and staring at an MRI with a giant black splotch in my left ankle. And that's a technical term that you might not have learned yet for all you students out there. But before I knew what a distal tibia was, and before I'd ever heard the words Ewing sarcoma, and before I knew that you could implant a portacath in a person's chest, and that you implant and not install or insert, and that small needles hurt less going in than big needles, and that you can taste a heparin flush, and what the hell is heparin anyway? And anything you eat while getting chemo is going to be blacklisted on your palate for the rest of your natural life. I still can't eat Apple Jolly Ranchers. And yes, there is a level of constipation you can reach that I had hitherto thought was impossible. Before all that, I was just a footloose, fancy-free 26-year-old roaming around the world, having a blast, trying to make sense of it all, and trying to figure out what my place was in it. I was a bartender in London. I worked in a brokerage firm in Paris. I was a bartender at the Grand Canyon. Sensing a theme. So I was on this great ride, and I was collecting these experiences and friends, and I was shaping my life as I was being shaped at the same time. Because that's what you do as a young adult, right? You try to make sense of things. And like Brad said, you're trying to find your place. You're trying to discover yourself. But it's not like there's this finished product out there that it's just waiting for you and you have to find, and then that's it. You're the very definition of a work in progress at this point. You try things on, you discard the things that don't fit, and you keep the ones that do. So if your relationship is not working, then hopefully you learn some lessons from that, and you move on, and you carry that with you into your future relationships until you find the right one. You can switch jobs until you find a path that speaks to you. How do you make decisions? How do you present yourself to the world? How do you decide what's important, what's not? Who do you want to be as a husband or a wife or a partner or a parent? What kind of lifestyle do you want? The point is that as opposed to being a child or an older adult, when you're in the very middle of creating yourself, of inventing yourself, something like cancer has an outsized impact, both in the moment and then in the far-reaching implications of that event. It doesn't just knock you off the path. It creates an entirely new path. Sometimes, unfortunately, a much shorter one, but sometimes a better one. But it's definitely one that you've not foreseen. You are not prepared for it. And it's pretty much a given you're never going to make it back onto your old path. Cancer's bad for everyone. There's no doubt about that. But while the questions and the needs often are the same for an AYA patient as opposed to an older or a younger patient, no matter what your age, everybody generally could use some help with psychosocial support, financial navigation, survivorship care. In young adults, the approach is more than likely very different. The answers can be very different as well. And the impact is different because of the age and stage of life. So, for example, in the life of a young cancer survivor, the financial trauma of the disease and the treatment can affect your decisions about your career, your marriage, even your living situation for a really long time. So I want to start with, I'll take survivorship care as an example. And David Fryer touched on it briefly earlier today. So it's important, right? Especially for young adults, given the potential length of the survivorship and potential for issues subsequently that relate both to the disease and the treatment. And of course, everyone should walk out of their final appointment with a survivorship care plan and detailing their treatment and with something to hand to other doctors and a schedule of things that you need to keep a lookout for, what tests to have when and what doctors you need to see down the road and what blood work and when to see a cardiologist. And it's great to have that plan, but when you put that underlying expectation over the real life and experience of a young person, and it gets a little more complicated. This patient is now in the process of an almost total restart, reinvention to this life that they were trying to build, and they may or may not put continuing medical care at the top of their priority list. Shocking, I know, depending on their means and circumstances. And the easy explanation, which is often accompanied by, a shrug or a throwing up of hands, is to say they're mobile, they're hard to keep in touch with, they may not have access to doctors, it's not a priority, it's going to be difficult, and maybe we should do something digital or text. Text is always the answer. And all that's true, but consider just for a minute that could only be part of the story and a partial solution. So whether you have a paper tool or a digital tool, if you text them about follow-ups or send them a postcard, if we want young people to take their survivorship care seriously and to make it a priority no matter where they land in the post-cancer world, for it to work, you have to go back a lot farther. And we have to build trust, and we have to empower them as self-advocates and enlist them as a partner in their own care from the beginning. So that's easier said than done for a lot of reasons, but here's one reason to consider, and Brad actually touched on this in his comments about patient mistrust. So when I was 26, I was, as is now obvious, a complete nomad. I didn't have a regular doctor before cancer, and I spent every day of my 13 months of treatment looking forward only to the day that I could escape my doctors again. No offense to doctors. I didn't get very far, obviously. And that alone would have made me a really challenging candidate to enlist in regular follow-up care. But there's another layer, which was that at the very beginning of my journey, my symptoms, which were excruciating pain, and my story had been dismissed by at least 4 doctors in the 8 months preceding my diagnosis. I had been accused of drug seeking and was reprimanded for asking about painkillers. I was one of those people that Brad talked about who entered my treatment viewing the entire medical community as suspect because these doctors, well-meaning though I am sure they were, viewed me through the lens of a healthy 26-year-old single female, and in their mind there was probably an additional interpretation of, likes to party. But they stopped right there. And minimizing, if not outright dismissing, my actual concerns and complaints. And as much as I like to think I'm special, I'm kind of not in this case, because I've heard this story a lot in different variations. And all that is to say that they didn't trust me, and so I lost faith in them. And it took a lot of time and effort for my own oncologist to rebuild that trust. And he did it largely by providing opportunities for me to call the shots and patiently responding every time I probed or questioned or challenged him. This is not meant to be a public shaming or to say that every young adult comes in with a chip on their shoulder from a delayed diagnosis. It's an extreme example that's meant to show actions early on in a young person's journey can have long-term consequences, both good and bad. Because when it comes to ingraining a sense of personal responsibility and building a partnership that can mean both a better treatment experience and will keep them from slamming the door in your face upon completion of therapy and never looking back, when it comes to starting on that path to healthy survivorship, that can start with you and your team. And it may start a lot earlier than you think because you have a window while they're in your care. You can achieve that trust and respect that will allow you, as their medical care team, to influence what comes afterwards. So get started early. It may mean taking the time to find out what happened before they walked in your door. You may have to validate their experiences. You might have to suck it up and apologize for your entire profession. but offer yourself as a partner in their care. And that different approach, the one built around them as a young person, can have significant long-term positive impact on their overall health and well-being, not just during their treatment, but for the rest of their lives, by guiding and supporting their transformation from a victim into an empowered self-advocate. There's some other issues that loom pretty large in young adulthood and may require you to stretch out of your comfort zone to address them properly, but they're important. So now I'm going to tell you one of my favorite stories. So I have another colleague who's a pediatric oncologist specializing in young adults, and she was treating a young man in his 20s with T-cell ALL. And he used to show up at every appointment with his girlfriend. But my friend noticed that the girlfriend had stopped coming to the appointments, and eventually he started skipping appointments as well, which obviously could have had a very detrimental effect on his therapy. But my friend persisted in reaching out to him and gradually drew him into a conversation, probably a very uncomfortable and kind of squirmy conversation, because he was revealed to her that his treatment was causing him to have sexual problems. And that did not make for a happy girlfriend. Thus her absence, thus his reduced motivation to come to appointments. So here's what my friend did not do. She did not scold, she did not preach, she did not judge, she did not dictate. She did a little research, and she ended up giving him a very specific prescription. Or as she puts it, I think I'm the only pediatric oncologist in the world prescribing Viagra. And believe me, he didn't miss any more appointments, because that's where she renewed his prescriptions. And the girlfriend was back. She was right there with them. So it's a win for everyone. But imagine the time it took to build enough trust to get to that level of candor. Sex is a huge issue for young adults and woefully under-discussed. So imagine what that took for her to put herself in his shoes and discover the underlying issue, to acknowledge its importance to him, and come up with a creative and yet elegantly simple solution to the problem. And it also was a leverage that increased compliance. A solution I think I can pretty safely say it's pretty far out of the realm of pediatric oncology. But when I say build trust, a lot of times that involves actually trusting these young adult patients and standing in their shoes and giving that perspective. I can safely say you should never assume that you know what's best for me, no matter how much you think you know what's best, because you're not me. And I'll give you another example that reflects on one of the key issues for young adults, a cancer-related issue that belongs to young adults more so than to any other age group, and that's fertility preservation. So my friend Lindsay Beck was diagnosed with recurrent tongue cancer in her early 20s, and this was back in the mid to late 90s, I think. And so when she was presented with her treatment options, the very first question she asked, as a young single woman with no boyfriend waiting in the wings, was whether she would still be able to have children and what she had to do to preserve that option for herself. There were no good answers. The first go-round, she had radiation to her head and neck, and so she said her doctor said, well, that's not going to matter, and you can have babies till the cows come home after that. She literally said, till the cows come home. But the second time around involved chemotherapy, and her doctor at that point was a different doctor, and he said she would have a 90% chance of sterility. But don't worry about that, because Lance Armstrong had the same chemotherapy, and he just had a bouncing baby boy. At which point, Lindsay stormed out into the waiting room and picked up the Glamour magazine in the waiting room that had the interview with Kristen Armstrong that said, "We're so happy that Lance banked sperm." And so she did her own research. At that point in time, there weren't really a lot of places for her to get the answers, but she did her research, she delayed her treatment, she froze her eggs. And after she finished her treatment, she started an organization called Fertile Hope that forced the conversation about treatment-induced sterilization and the ethical responsibility to inform patients of their risks and offer information on all available fertility preservation options. And perhaps most important for our conversation today, she was a driving force behind bridging the worlds of reproductive endocrinology and oncology, another new field that is now known as oncofertility, and it had never previously existed. The act of fertility preservation is so powerful. It stands for hope, and it stands for a future. Dean Brown, who has been a star on the MTV shows, was our keynote speaker at Critical Mass in the meeting a couple of weeks ago, and she flat out said she's in treatment for recurrent ovarian cancer, but is going through fertility preservation. But she said, "I couldn't do any more chemo without having some hope in the freezer." Literally, could not do any more chemo without having that security, that vision of hope and of a future. When I asked Lindsay what she would tell you if she were standing here in my place, she said, "Tell us our risks. We want to hear them. Don't assume that I don't want to know because it's too much to handle, it's too expensive, I'm single, I'm gay, I already have kids. Tell us no matter what, every time. Trust me, no one wants to be unknowingly sterilized." And number 2, have a referral handy. We don't need or want you to be a fertility expert, but know where to send me so I can be aware of all my options. Lindsay has 3 beautiful children, and I think it's okay for me to share this. She and her husband are expecting number 4. The world has changed. And that's important because, as Brandon said today, the field of oncofertility is an example of what can happen if you're willing to build bridges and reach out to collaborate with others for the benefit of the patient around a key shared issue. Topics like fertility can open doors for conversations and subsequently processes and practices and policies that actually put the patient and their needs as a young person at the center and can create those all-important early wins. Because in the real world, care of young adults cuts across all of the silos in our system: adult, pediatric, community, academic, and a young person, no matter where they end up, is always going to end up on the wrong side of something. I was a 26-year-old with Ewing sarcoma, pediatric cancer. So where's the best place for me to go? Do I go with the tiny toilets? Or do I go to the place where, my doctor doesn't see Ewing sarcoma every day? It's a trade-off. And why do I have to make that trade-off? But if bridges can be built around fertility, they can be built in other places. I look at Dr. Siegel and Dr. Tripathi as pediatric and adult co-medical directors of the AWA program, and I have hope for progress in places where, as Brandon said, the culture has been fostered, institutional support exists, and the commitment to do the right thing is strong. So back to the field. The need for connection and collaboration and shared understanding has never been greater, and the level of awareness we've reached over the last decade has made the environment ripe for building such connections. There are people who are interested, who are excited, who want to reach out, who want to know more. Today is a magic moment. The Cancer Center director's here, the Strouds are here. You guys are on the cutting edge of taking the AYA movement to the next level. which is figuring out how to move beyond individual champions and institutionalize the understanding of the young adult patient as part of a distinct group with unique needs, so that each patient, like the ones I've talked about today, aren't approached as a one-of-a-kind case with weird or difficult issues or challenges like delayed diagnoses or defiant behavior or sex or fertility. You can lead us into a world where an AYA approach is normalized and appropriate care is built in, so that when a patient like me or Lindsay or David walks in the doors, they don't feel like a freak, like no one was expecting them, or no one understands their needs. And perhaps, just perhaps, as Dr. Gruber and Dr. Tripathi said this morning, what we learn from taking care of young adults will help us take better care of all cancer patients. Last night at the reception, I was really struck by something Dan said, which was, David would have wanted us all to meet each other. And I've been thinking about that ever since. The simplicity and sort of the power of that statement. When I started Planet Cancer, my goal was simple, which was to help young adult patients find each other. I knew the power of community, and I knew how it could help to know that another person was facing the same issues. Because with community comes shared solutions and the support that you might not otherwise hear of or have access to. And we can apply those same lessons to the field. We start by doing what David would have wanted. We just meet each other. But we can't stop there. We have to progress to actually working together, trusting each other, building bridges, breaking conventions, developing partnerships, and fostering compromise. So back to the patient perspective. It's pretty simple, really. When I take off my professional hat and I step back and I look at the field of AYA as a patient, I'm thinking, keep the faith. We have come so far. There's so much good information that you've seen today, and 10 years ago we wouldn't have even dreamed of having that. But we have a long way to go. And believe me, I know all the answers and the roadblocks and the funding deficits and the structural barriers that you are thinking about right now. I can see it in your faces. I know them as well as I know the faces of my children, because I think about them every day. But changing the world is not for the weak or the faint-hearted. But as my new favorite quote goes, you never know how strong you are until being strong is the only choice you have. David Stroud. So be strong and keep the faith, and we can do this. Thank you.